The bluish light of the monitor was the only source of illumination in Lucas Mendez's small apartment. It was 3 in the morning, and the silence of the early hours was broken only by the soft drumming of his fingers on the keyboard and the constant hum of the computer fan. The coffee, already cold in the mug beside the keyboard, had been forgotten hours ago when his eyes first found the name that now filled his screen: Father Pellegrino Ernetti. Lucas adjusted his glasses on his nose and leaned closer to the screen, as if physical proximity could bring him closer to the truth he pursued. His eyes, already red from too many hours in front of the monitor, eagerly scanned the lines of text on an obscure forum dedicated to lost technologies and conspiracy theories. There, amidst reports of anti-gravity machines and interdimensional communicators, was what appeared to be a leaked dossier on the Cronovisor, a device capable of capturing residual waves of light and sound from past events. He murmured to himself, copying excerpts into a document developed by a Benedictine priest in the 1950s, demonstrated to Vatican authorities, subsequently dismantled and archived. The apartment around Lucas reflected the state of his mind, organized in its own chaos. On the walls, hand-drawn mind maps connected names, dates, and events with red lines. Books on quantum physics shared space with tomos of medieval theology and biographies of forgotten inventors. The smell of old paper mixed with the odor of instant food and coffee, creating an atmosphere that, for any other person, would be suffocating. But for Lucas was the familiar scent of knowledge in construction. As dawn approached, Lucas delved deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. The Cronovisor was not just a historical curiosity, it was a growing obsession. Every new piece of information he found seemed to whisper promises of forbidden knowledge, of a technology that challenged not only the laws of physics, but also the boundaries between science and faith. Ernetti claimed to have witnessed the crucifixion of Christ, he read aloud, feeling a shiver run down his spine, and a performance of Thyestes, a lost play by Quintus Ennius, from the 3rd century BC. Lucas stood up, feeling his muscles protest after hours of immobility. He walked to the window and slightly parted the curtain. Outside, the city slept under a starless sky, covered by low clouds that reflected the orange glow of the streetlights. The contrast between the outside world, practical, tangible, ordinary, and the universe of possibilities he had just discovered, made him feel strangely displaced, as if he existed between two realities. He returned to the computer and continued his search. That's when he found the first mention of a name not in the official records: Father Augusto Salvatore, supposedly a close assistant to Ernetti, who had secretly continued the research after the official project was dismantled. Salvatore, the name escaped his lips as a sigh as he typed it into different search combinations. The information was scarce, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle scattered in obscure corners of the internet. But a pattern was emerging, a shadow forming between the lines of the documents he found. Reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen Salvatore in places where unexplained deaths occurred. Rumors about a secret laboratory in an abandoned monastery. Theories about how the Cronovisor could be used not only to observe the past, but to influence it in some way. Hours passed, and dawn light began to filter through the curtain cracks when Lucas finally found something concrete: a black and white photograph, dated 1972, showing Ernetti alongside a tall, austere man, identified in the caption as a Salvatore. What caught his attention, however, was the object partially visible in the background, a circular metal structure that looked unlike anything he had ever seen before. With fingers trembling from caffeine and excitement, Lucas zoomed in on the image, trying to distinguish details of the structure. It was like a futuristic confessional, with components that seemed decades ahead of their time. He saved the image and continued his search, now with renewed focus. It was when the sun was already high in the sky that he found the clue that would change everything. In a digitized archive of a local Italian newspaper, dated 1987, a small note about the transfer of unspecified equipment from the Vatican to the monastery of San Cipriano in the mountains of northern Italy. The monastery that, according to another source, had been abandoned after a mysterious fire in 1992, and where Augusto Salvatore had last been seen. Lucas leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of fatigue and revelation. His gaze wandered around the apartment, over the walls covered with notes, the stacked books, the forgotten meal remnants. His life, which until then seemed empty and purposeless, was now filled with a mission, a quest that transcended the mundane. The Cronovisor existed. It was hidden somewhere, perhaps in that abandoned monastery. And if the theories were correct, if Salvatore had indeed found a way to use the device for more than just observing the past, the implications were terrifying. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the apartment spin around him. When he opened them again, his decision was already made. He needed to find the monastery. He needed to discover the truth about the Cronovisor and about Augusto Salvatore. With methodical movements, he began to organize his discoveries, preparing for the journey that awaited him. As he worked, he did not notice the subtle change in the apartment's atmosphere, as if the air had become denser, as if he were being observed by invisible eyes through the layers of time. Outside, the day advanced, indifferent to the discoveries that had been made during the night. But for Lucas, the world would never be the same. He had found the Ernetti dossier, and now he was inextricably connected to its secrets. What he did not yet know was that, by seeking the observer of time, he had become the observed, and that the waves of his curiosity were already reverberating through the fabric of reality, reaching ears that had long awaited someone like him. The train snaked through the alpine valleys, cutting through the ancient fabric of the landscape like a needle. Lucas watched through the fogged window as the mountains loomed majestically against the grey sky. 3 days had passed since his discovery of the Ernetti dossier, and now he was on his way to northern Italy, carrying only a backpack with essentials and a laptop loaded with all the information he had managed to gather. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks induced an almost hypnotic state, and Lucas realized that his thoughts floated between wakefulness and a strange torpor. He had slept little since deciding to follow this lead, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. He closed his eyes for a moment, and images of the Cronovisor danced in his mind, the circular metal, the pulsating lights, the secrets of time imprisoned within its structure. Next stop, Montesilvano. A metallic voice announced over the train's sound system, jolting Lucas from his reverie. It was the last station before his descent in Valambra, the small village at the foot of the mountains where the monastery of San Cipriano was located. The sky darkened rapidly when he finally arrived in Valambra. The station was little more than a covered platform, and Lucas was the only passenger to disembark. The cold mountain air penetrated his clothes, bringing with it the smell of pines and damp earth. The village, judging by the sparse lights that dotted the hillside, seemed small and isolated, the kind of place where strangers are immediately noticed and remembered. With his backpack on, Lucas followed the only road leading out of the station. The silence was almost tangible, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves in the trees that lined the path. There was no one on the streets, and the few houses he saw seemed closed in on themselves, as if protecting themselves from something more than just the cold night. He found a small guest house in the central square of the village, a 2-story stone building with wooden windows and a faded sign that swayed gently in the breeze. Upon entering, he was greeted by the warmth of a fireplace and the curious gaze of the proprietress, an elderly woman with grey hair and a face marked by time. Buonasera, she greeted him in Italian, studying him with eyes that seemed to see beyond his tired appearance. Looking for accommodation. Lucas nodded, responding in his limited Italian. As he filled out the guest register, he felt the woman's gaze fixed on him, as if she were trying to decipher an enigma. "Tourism?" she asked, with a tone that suggested tourists were rare at that time of year. "Research," Lucas replied, maintaining intentional vagueness. "I'm interested in local history, especially the monastery of San Cipriano." Upon mentioning the monastery, he noticed a subtle change in the woman's expression, an almost imperceptible stiffening of her facial muscles, a glimmer of apprehension in her eyes. "The monastery has been closed for many years," she said, handing him the room key. "There's nothing there but ruins and bad memories." Lucas wanted to ask more, but something in the woman's definitive tone made him hold back. There would be time for questions in the morning. Now, he needed to rest and organize his thoughts. The room was simple but clean, a single bed, an antique wardrobe, a desk under the window that overlooked the square. Lucas placed his backpack on the bed and sat down at the desk, opening his laptop. The internet connection was surprisingly good for such a remote place, and he took the opportunity to check his emails and review his notes on the monastery. That's when he noticed something strange. A pattern of interference on the screen, almost imperceptible, but which seemed to pulse at a regular rhythm. He adjusted the video settings, but the pattern persisted. Curious, he opened a frequency analysis program he occasionally used in his programming projects and directed it to the laptop's microphone. The result made him frown in confusion. A constant frequency was being picked up, too low to be heard by the human ear, but definitely present. A regular sound wave, like a mechanical heartbeat, emanating from somewhere nearby. Lucas stood up and walked around the room, observing how the signal intensity varied. It was strongest near the window. He looked out at the dark and silent square, and then at the mountains beyond it. Somewhere in that direction was the monastery, hidden among the trees and fog. He returned to the laptop and began to research ultra-low frequency waves and their possible effects. The results were a mix of legitimate science and conspiracy theories, from military uses for submarine communication to claims of mind control and time manipulation. One page in particular caught his attention. A scientific article on how certain frequencies could theoretically interact with what the author called the quantum memory of space-time. The idea was that events left impressions on the very fabric of reality, and that these impressions could, in theory, be accessed through the application of specific electromagnetic fields. The author of the article, Dr. Antonio Salvatore, published in 1983, shortly before his disappearance from the academic community. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. He was on the right track. The Cronovisor existed, and it was somewhere nearby, emitting that strange, constant frequency. He decided he couldn't wait until morning. He needed to investigate now, while the village slept. He put on a warmer coat, grabbed a flashlight from his backpack, and quietly left the room. The guest house was silent. The proprietress had apparently already retired. Lucas slipped down the stairs and out the back door, avoiding the creak of the main entrance hinges. Outside, the night had deepened. There was no visible moon, only a heavy sky of clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. Lucas turned on the frequency analysis app on his phone and began to follow the signal, which led him out of the village, up a narrow path that climbed the mountainside. The air grew colder as he ascended, and the vegetation denser. The path, once clear, became an almost imperceptible trail between ancient trees and moss-covered rocks. The only light came from his flashlight, which cast unsettling shadows among the tree trunks. It was when the path took a sharp bend that Lucas saw it for the first time, the monastery of San Cipriano, a dark silhouette outlined against the night sky. Even from a distance and in the darkness, its decaying grandeur was perceptible. Partially collapsed towers, windows like empty eye sockets, ivy-covered walls that seemed to merge the structure with the mountain itself. And the signal was stronger now, pulsing on his phone like an insistent call. Lucas hesitated at the edge of the clearing that surrounded the monastery. There was something in the atmosphere of the place that made his instincts scream in alarm. A silence that seemed alive, watching, waiting. But his curiosity was stronger than his fear. With cautious steps, he approached what appeared to be the main entrance, a large, partially charred wooden portal, hanging on oxidized hinges. The door was ajar, as if inviting him in. The interior of the monastery was a labyrinth of dark corridors and empty rooms. The smell of mofo and ancient ashes permeated the air, mixed with something else, a metallic, almost electrical odor. Lucas followed the signal on his phone, which led him deeper and deeper into the complex, descending stone staircases worn by time, passing abandoned chapels where statues of saints watched his passage with empty eyes. It was in a particularly narrow corridor that Lucas noticed something strange on the walls. Initially, they seemed to be just damp stains, but as he brought his flashlight closer, he realized they were burn marks in circular patterns, as if some kind of energy had been released there. The signal finally led him to a metal door at the end of an underground corridor. Unlike the rest of the monastery, this door seemed new, incongruous with the antiquity around it, and it was locked. An electronic lock glowed softly in the dark, requiring an access code. Lucas examined the lock, trying to determine if he could bypass it somehow. That's when he noticed something engraved on the metal of the door, a symbol he recognized from the documents he had studied, the same symbol that appeared in the corners of Father Ernetti's photographs with his assistant. As he pondered what to do next, the silence was broken by a sound that chilled his blood. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the corridors behind him. Someone, or something, was approaching. Lucas quickly turned off his flashlight and pressed himself against the wall beside the door, trying to merge with the shadows. The footsteps continued, inexorable, getting closer and closer, and with them came a new sound, a low, constant hum, like that of an electrical transformer, but with an almost organic quality, as if it were breathing. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, and Lucas felt the hairs on his arm bristle. The frequency on his phone began to oscillate violently, the screen flickering with erratic patterns. And then, just as the footsteps seemed about to turn the corner of the corridor, everything stopped. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. The frequency on his phone stabilized again, pulsing at its constant, hypnotic rhythm. Lucas waited, barely daring to breathe, counting the seconds that turned into minutes. When he finally gathered the courage to turn his flashlight back on, the corridor was empty. But something had changed. The metal door, previously firmly closed, was now ajar, revealing an even deeper darkness beyond. With his heart pounding in his chest, Lucas slowly pushed the door open. What he found on the other side defied everything he believed possible. A laboratory, perfectly preserved and apparently functional, stretched out before him. Sophisticated electronic equipment covered the walls, screens displayed incomprehensible data, and in the center was the Cronovisor, exactly as in the photographs he had found, but larger, more imposing. A circular structure of metal and glass, pulsing with a bluish light that seemed to emanate from within. Cables and tubes connected it to generators and computers, forming a technological web that seemed alive, pulsating. Lucas approached slowly, mesmerized by the sight. The hum he had heard earlier emanated from the device, now stronger, more insistent. It was as if the Cronovisor was calling to him, inviting him to unravel its secrets. Beside the device was a table with scattered documents, handwritten notes, diagrams, photographs. Lucas picked up one of the photographs and examined it under his flashlight. It showed a series of people, all with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. And in each photograph, almost imperceptible in the background, the same figure, a tall man with grey hair and piercing eyes, Augusto Salvatore. That's when he noticed the dates on the photographs. All corresponded to dates of unexplained deaths or disappearances he had found in his initial research. Deaths that, somehow, seemed connected to Salvatore. Lucas felt a knot in his stomach as he understood what he was seeing. The Cronovisor was not just a device for observing the past, it was a weapon. A tool that allowed its operator to manipulate events through time, to cause deaths that would appear to be accidents or coincidences. And as this realization hit him, the frequency emitted by the Cronovisor subtly changed. The hum became sharper, more urgent, the lights flickered, and for a moment, Lucas had the impression of seeing shapes moving in the shadows around the laboratory, human silhouettes that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. With trembling fingers, Lucas took out his phone to photograph the documents, to record what he had found. But the screen was completely taken over by static, unusable. The dead frequency had transformed into something more, something alive, conscious, that seemed to be reacting to his presence. That's when he heard the footsteps again, this time closer, more determined. And with them, a voice soft, almost gentle, but filled with an authority that made Lucas shiver. "You've finally arrived," the voice said, coming from somewhere in the shadows beyond the Cronovisor. "I've been waiting for you, Lucas Mendez." Lucas turned sharply, his flashlight trembling in his hand, partially illuminating the figure that emerged from the darkness, an elderly man, but with an upright posture and piercing gaze. The same man from the photographs. The same man who had stood beside Ernetti decades ago. Augusto Salvatore smiled, a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Welcome to my sanctuary," he said, gesturing to the Cronovisor. "You have many questions, I know, and I have all the answers you seek." As Salvatore spoke, the Cronovisor pulsed more intensely, and the dead frequency that had guided Lucas there now seemed to engulf him completely, penetrating his thoughts, altering his perception of reality. The laboratory seemed to distort around him, the walls breathing like a living organism. "You are not the first to follow the signal," Salvatore continued, slowly approaching, "but perhaps you are the most promising." Lucas tried to back away, but found he couldn't move. It was as if the frequency itself held him in place, a prisoner of time and space that the Cronovisor controlled. "What do you want from me?" he managed to ask, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Salvatore stopped a few steps away, his eyes reflecting the bluish light of the Cronovisor. "I want what I've always wanted," he replied. "A witness, someone who understands the greatness of what I've created. Someone who can appreciate how I've rewritten the rules of time itself." And as he spoke, the Cronovisor began to spin, its lights intensifying, the dead frequency transforming into a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. Voices of people who were not there, or perhaps were, trapped in some limbo between past and present. Lucas felt his consciousness begin to fragment under the assault of that impossible frequency. His last clear vision was of Salvatore walking towards the Cronovisor, his contours seeming to merge with the machine, as if man and device were a single entity. And then darkness enveloped him, carrying him away from that underground laboratory to a place where time did not flow in a straight line, but in concentric circles that converged to a single point, a point where past, present, and future coexisted in a symphony of dead frequencies and buried secrets that refused to remain forgotten. Lucas's consciousness returned slowly, like waves breaking on a distant shore. First came the sensation, the cold of the stone beneath his body, the dampness of the air on his skin. Then the sounds, a constant dripping somewhere nearby, the low, persistent hum that now seemed to be a part of him. Finally, when he opened his eyes, the sight almost complete darkness, broken only by a faint bluish glow coming from somewhere beyond his immediate field of vision. He was lying on the stone floor of a small cell. There were no windows, only a heavy wooden door with a small bard opening at eye level. The air had an ancient smell of incense and mold, mixed with a metallic odor he now recognized as belonging to the Cronovisor. Lucas tried to get up, but a dizziness forced him to remain seated, his back against the cold wall. His mind was fragmented, memories and thoughts mixing like puzzle pieces scattered on the floor. He remembered the laboratory, the Cronovisor pulsing with that impossible blue light, and Salvatore emerging from the shadows like an apparition. How long? He murmured to himself, his voice hoarse from the dryness in his throat. There was no way to know if he had been unconscious for hours or days. His watch had stopped, its hands frozen at 3:27, though he couldn't determine if it was morning or afternoon. Forcing himself to his feet, Lucas staggered to the door and looked through the barred opening. A stone corridor stretched in both directions, illuminated by old lamps that cast a shaky yellowish light. There was no sign of Salvatore or anyone else. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered, punctuated by the constant dripping of water somewhere distant. Lucas returned to the center of the cell, trying to organize his thoughts. He needed to understand where he was and what Salvatore intended to do with him. More importantly, he needed to find out more about the Cronovisor and how the ex-priest was using it to commit crimes. That's when he noticed something in the corner of the cell. A small black-covered notebook, apparently left there on purpose. He picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. The pages were filled with elegant and precise Italian calligraphy. On the first page, a single phrase in English, "To the curious observer." Lucas sat down again and began to read, mentally translating the Italian. The notebook was a diary written by Salvatore himself, detailing his journey from the first experiments with Ernetti to the development of his own version of the Cronovisor. The first entries described the initial fascination with the possibility of observing the past, witnessing historical events, confirming religious truths, expanding human knowledge. There was an almost childish idealism in those pages, a genuine belief in the beneficial potential of the invention. But as Lucas continued reading, he could feel the gradual shift in the tone of the entries. The frustration with the limitations imposed by the church, the bitterness when the official project was terminated, the determination to continue alone in secret, and then the discovery that changed everything. October 17, 1986. Lucas read in a low voice. Today I witnessed something extraordinary. The Cronovisor not only observes the past, it interacts with it. During the experiment with the scene of Giulio Farnese's assassination in 1924, I noticed that when I focused intensely on a specific object in the scene, a wine glass on the table, the object trembled slightly. I repeated the experiment several times, always with the same result. The Cronovisor is creating some kind of quantum bridge between the present and the past, allowing a limited form of causal interaction. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. The implications were terrifying. If the Cronovisor allowed not only observation but also influence of past events, even minimally. He continued reading, the entries becoming increasingly disturbing. Salvatore described progressively bolder experiments, moving small objects in the past, creating temporal anomalies that resulted in seemingly inexplicable accidents. And with each success, his vision became more distorted, transforming into something monstrous disguised as divine justice. Read a particularly unsettling entry. Today I executed God's will. This man, who escaped earthly justice after abusing and killing 3 children in 1987, met his deserved end. Through the Cronovisor, I located him in his apartment in Milan 3 days ago. I focused on the electrical wire of his heater, inducing a fault that resulted in a fire while he slept. The newspapers will report another tragic domestic accident, but I know the truth. I am not a murderer. I am an instrument of divine justice, correcting the errors of time. Lucas closed the notebook for a moment, feeling nauseous. Salvatore had convinced himself that he was a vigilante, using the Cronovisor to identify sinners and then manipulate past events to cause their deaths in the present. Deaths that would appear to be accidents or coincidences to the world, but which were, in fact, meticulously planned executions through time. Forcing himself to continue, Lucas reopened the diary and read the most recent entries. Salvatore described an evolution in his experiments, not only manipulating objects in the past, but beginning to perceive that he could influence thoughts and decisions, subtly, almost imperceptibly. He was learning to plant suggestions in people's minds through the Cronovisor, leading them to commit fatal errors or to make decisions that would result in their own destruction. The last entry was dated only 3 days ago. The new observer will arrive soon. I can feel him approaching, following the signal like all the others before him. But this one is different. I see in him a potential that the others did not have. Perhaps, finally, I have found the apprentice I was looking for. Someone to continue my work when I am no longer here. Time is running out for me. I can feel it. The Cronovisor takes its toll on those who use it. But before I leave, I must ensure that my mission continues. Lucas closed the diary, his mind processing the implications. Salvatore had not imprisoned him merely out of curiosity or to silence him. He saw him as a possible successor, someone to continue his twisted work of divine justice through time manipulation. The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his thoughts. Quickly, he hid the diary under the thin mattress in his cell and positioned himself facing the door. The footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, until they stopped on the other side of the wooden door. There was a moment of silence, and then the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door opened slowly, revealing the tall, imposing figure of Augusto Salvatore. He looked different in normal light, older, more fragile than he appeared in the shadows of the laboratory. His face was a network of deep wrinkles, and his eyes, though still piercing, had a feverish gleam that spoke of obsession and, perhaps, madness. "You read my diary," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. His voice was soft, almost gentle, with a slight Italian accent. "Good. That makes our conversation easier." Lucas took a step back, keeping his distance. "You're a murderer," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You used the Cronovisor to kill people." Salvatore entered the cell, closing the door behind him. His face contorted into an expression of "Murderer, no, my young man. I am a judge, an executor of divine will. Those who perished deserved their fate. No one has the right to decide who lives or dies, Lucas replied. What you did, what you are doing, is monstrous. A sad smile appeared on Salvatore's lips. It's easy to judge when you only see the surface, but I saw beyond. I saw the true nature of time and justice. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Lucas. The Cronovisor showed me that time is not linear, as we believe. It is a complex fabric where past, present, and future exist simultaneously, where every action creates waves that propagate in all directions. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something hypnotic in Salvatore's voice, something that made his words seem almost reasonable, despite the horror they described. "Come with me," Salvatore said, gesturing to the door. "I want to show you something." Part of Lucas wanted to refuse, to remain in the relative safety of the cell, but he knew he had no real choice. If he wanted to fully understand what was happening, he needed to see more. He needed to gather information that could eventually help him escape and expose Salvatore. He followed the exorcist down the stone corridor, noticing that they were in a different part of the monastery, deeper and older than the laboratory he had found. The walls here were of rough stone, without the modern coating of the laboratory, and the air was colder, laden with the weight of centuries. They descended a spiral staircase, the light growing fainter with each step. Lucas could feel the pressure increasing in his ears, as if they were descending to a great depth, and with the descent, the hum he had noticed earlier became more pronounced, more insistent. Finally, they arrived at a circular metal door, similar to a vault door, with strange symbols engraved on its surface. Salvatore placed his hand on a panel beside the door, and Lucas heard the sound of mechanisms moving internally. The door slid open, revealing a chamber beyond. What Lucas saw made his heart almost stop. The chamber was circular, much larger than the laboratory he had found before, and occupying almost the entire space was an enlarged version of the Cronovisor, a complex metallic structure that rose from the floor to the ceiling, pulsing with that same bluish light, but much more intense, almost painful to the eyes. In the center of the structure was something like a chair, surrounded by screens and control panels. Cables and tubes extended from the main structure, connecting to equipment around the room. And on the walls of the chamber, covering every available inch, were photographs, hundreds of them, showing people of all ages and eras, many marked with a red X. "My true sanctuary," Salvatore said, his voice reverent. "What you saw before was just a monitoring station. This is the heart of the Cronovisor." Lucas looked around, horrified and fascinated at the same time. All these people. Sinners, Salvatore interrupted. Murderers, rapists, torturers. People who escaped human justice, but not divine justice. He walked to the wall of photographs and touched one of them with something close to affection. This man poisoned his wife for money in 1973. This other abused dozens of children in an orphanage in the 1980s. This woman, he pointed to another photograph. She killed her own children and blamed an innocent man who spent 20 years in prison. Lucas felt his stomach churn. Salvatore's twisted logic was even more disturbing, because it contained a grain of truth. These were, indeed, terrible people who had committed heinous acts. But the idea that one man could appoint himself judge, jury, and executioner, manipulating the very fabric of time to carry out his personal version of justice. "How do you find them?" he asked, trying to buy time as he absorbed what he was seeing. Salvatore smiled, apparently pleased with the interest. "The Cronovisor can tune into any point in space-time, as long as you have the correct coordinates. Initially, I sought out famous cases, unsolved crimes, but over time, the Cronovisor itself began to guide me." His gaze became distant. "It's as if it developed a consciousness of its own, an ability to detect evil through the layers of time." He approached the central chair and caressed it as if it were a pet. "Sit down," he invited. "I want to show you how it works." Lucas hesitated. Sitting in that chair, in the heart of the Cronovisor, seemed dangerously intimate, like surrendering his mind to something he didn't fully understand. "Don't be afraid," Salvatore said, noticing his hesitation. "I won't harm you. You are too valuable for that." Reluctantly, Lucas approached the chair. Up close, he could see that it was more complex than it initially seemed, equipped with sensors and small electrodes that presumed were meant to make contact with the occupant's body. "What happens when I sit down?" he asked, still resisting. "You will see what I see," Salvatore replied. "You will feel what I feel. You will understand why I do what I do." Lucas knew he should refuse, that he should try to escape, find help, expose Salvatore to the world. But the curiosity that had led him there, the same curiosity that had made him spend sleepless nights researching the Cronovisor, now pushed him towards that chair. He needed to know. He needed to see. Slowly, he sat down. The sensors adjusted automatically, making contact with his arms, neck, and temples. He felt a slight tingling, like static electricity running through his skin. Salvatore moved to a control panel nearby and began to adjust dials and switches. The hum around them intensified, and the bluish light pulsed more rapidly. "I will show you a recent case," he said, his voice now distant, as if coming from far away. "A man named Victor Rossetti, a pedophile who had been operating in Rome for decades, protected by political connections. The police never managed to gather enough evidence against him, despite dozens of victims." The chamber lights dimmed, and Lucas felt a strange sensation, as if he were being pulled out of his own body. Reality around him began to distort, the chamber walls becoming translucent, then transparent until he was somewhere else. A street in Rome, recognizable by its characteristic architecture. It was night, and the street was almost empty. He could feel the warm air of the Italian summer, hear the distant sound of music coming from a nearby restaurant, smell the aroma of food and car exhaust, and he could see a man, middle-aged, well-dressed, walking alone on the sidewalk. Victor Rossetti, he presumed. The sensation was indescribable. It wasn't like watching a video or even being physically present. It was like being a ghost, a disembodied consciousness floating in time and space, observing without being observed. "You are seeing through the Cronovisor," Salvatore's voice came, seeming to originate from inside his own head. "This scene occurred 3 weeks ago. Observe." Lucas saw Rossetti stop in front of an apartment building and look up, as if checking something. Then, the man entered the building, using a key to open the main door. The scene changed, and now Lucas was inside an apartment. Rossetti entered, closed the door behind him, and turned on the lights. The apartment was luxurious, decorated with expensive artwork and elegant furniture. Rossetti walked to a bar in the corner of the room and poured himself a drink. "Now, observe carefully," Salvatore's voice said. Lucas saw Rossetti walk to a bookshelf and press something. The bookshelf slid aside, revealing a secret compartment. From inside, the man took out a metal box, which he opened with a small key he carried in his pocket. The contents of the box made Lucas feel sick. Photographs, dozens of them, showing children in situations no child should be in. Rossetti's face, as he examined the photos, was a mask of perverse pleasure. "You see," Salvatore whispered in his mind, "you see the evil that walks among us, disguised as respectability." Lucas wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He wasn't really there. He had no control over where his vision was directed. Now, observe what happens when the Cronovisor not only observes, but interacts. The scene continued. Rossetti put the photographs back in the box, closed the secret compartment, and returned to his drink. He sat in a leather armchair, turned on the television, and relaxed, like any normal person after a day's work. That's when Lucas noticed something strange. One of the electrical cables behind the television began to vibrate subtly, almost imperceptibly. The vibration gradually increased, and small sparks began to emerge where the insulation was slightly worn. Rossetti noticed nothing, absorbed in his program. The sparks increased, and then, suddenly, a small flame appeared. In seconds, the fire spread to the nearby curtains, and in less than a minute, the entire wall was in flames. When Rossetti finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The fire blocked the only exit from the apartment. The man screamed, ran to the windows, but they were locked with security bars, ironically installed to keep intruders out, now keeping him trapped inside. Lucas watched, horrified, as Rossetti succumbed to the smoke and flames. He could do nothing. He wasn't really there. He was just an impotent witness to an event that had already occurred. The scene faded, and Lucas found himself back in the Cronovisor chamber, still seated in the central chair. His body was covered in cold sweat, and he trembled uncontrollably. Salvatore was beside him, watching him with an expression of expectation. "Now you understand," he said. "The Cronovisor allows me to identify those who escaped earthly justice and ensure they receive what they deserve. It is not murder, it is divine justice." Lucas tried to get up, but his limbs felt too heavy. You manipulated that electrical cable," he managed to say. "You caused the fire. I merely created the conditions for justice to manifest," Salvatore replied, his voice calm and reasonable, as if he were explaining something simple to a child. "The Cronovisor allows small manipulations, an electrical cable that fails, a car brake that doesn't respond, a gas valve that opens on its own. Small things that seem like accidents or coincidences to the world, but which are, in fact, the hand of justice in action." Lucas finally managed to get up, moving away from the chair and Salvatore. "That's not justice," he said, his voice firmer now. "It's revenge. It's you playing God." A flash of anger crossed Salvatore's face, quickly replaced by an expression of pity. You still don't fully understand, but you will, in time. He stepped closer to Lucas, who backed away until he felt the cold wall against his back. I don't have much time left in this world, Salvatore continued. The Cronovisor takes its toll on those who use it ostensibly. I can feel my own timeline wearing thin. He held out his hands, and Lucas noticed for the first time how they trembled constantly, as if vibrating at a different frequency from the reality around them. I need someone to continue my work, Salvatore said, his eyes fixed on Lucas. Someone with the right mind, the right curiosity, the right understanding of good and evil. You, Lucas Mendez. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. I would never do what you do, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I would never use this thing to kill people. Salvatore smiled, a sad, knowing smile. You say that now, but the longer you spend with the Cronovisor, the more you will see the world as it truly is. You will see the evil that walks among us, disguised as normality. And eventually, you will understand that some people simply don't deserve to exist. He turned and walked back to the control panel. I will leave you to think about what you saw today. Return to your cell. Rest. Tomorrow, I will show you more. Two men Lucas hadn't noticed before. Large, silent, with blank expressions, materialized from the shadows in the corners of the chamber. Guards, he presumed, though there was something strange about them. Something not entirely human in their movements and gazes. As he was escorted back to his cell, Lucas tried to process everything he had seen and heard. The Cronovisor was more powerful and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. And Salvatore, in his madness, had convinced himself that he was an instrument of divine justice, when in reality he was just a killer using a technology he didn't fully comprehend. Back in his cell, Lucas sat on the thin mattress, trembling despite the stuffy air. He closed his eyes, but the image of Rossetti, consumed by flames, remained etched on his eyelids. He could still feel the heat of the fire, hear the desperate screams, smell the smoke and burning flesh. The Cronovisor not only allowed observation of the past, it created a complete sensory connection, as if the observer were truly present. And if what Salvatore said was true, it also allowed a limited form of interaction, of event manipulation. The implications were terrifying. If such technology fell into the wrong hands, but then, Lucas realized with a shiver, it already was in the wrong hands. In the hands of a man who had distorted its original purpose of observation and learning, transforming it into a tool of execution. And now, this man wanted Lucas to become his apprentice, his successor. He wanted to pass on not only the knowledge of the Cronovisor, but also his distorted vision of justice. Lucas knew he needed to escape, to warn someone about what was happening in this isolated monastery. But how? And even if he succeeded, who would believe his story about an ex-priest using a time machine to commit murders? As he contemplated his limited options, Lucas did not notice the subtle change in the cell's atmosphere. The air seemed to grow denser, more charged with that strange energy emanating from the Cronovisor. And in the shadows of the corners, indistinct shapes began to form, human silhouettes that appeared and disappeared like phantasmas, the echoes of Salvatore's victims trapped in some limbo between past and present, watching the new candidate for shadow observer with empty, accusing eyes. The shadows in Lucas's cell grew deeper as night fell over the monastery. The faint blue glow that seemed to permeate the entire structure intensified in the darkness, casting eerie patterns on the stone walls. Lucas sat on the edge of his thin mattress, Salvatore's diary clutched in his trembling hands, trying to make sense of everything he had witnessed. The Cronovisor was far more than a window to the past. It was a bridge, a conduit that somehow allowed its operator to reach across time and influence events. And Salvatore, in his twisted righteousness, had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner of those he deemed unworthy of life. Lucas closed his eyes, but the images from the demonstration remained vivid in his mind. Rossetti, trapped in his burning apartment, the flames consuming everything, the man's desperate screams. What disturbed him most wasn't just the horror of the scene, but the small, shameful part of himself that had felt a flicker of satisfaction watching a child abuser meet such an end. "Is that how it starts?" he whispered to the empty cell. "Is that how Salvatore began? With righteous anger that slowly corrupted into something monstrous?" A soft sound from the corner of the cell made Lucas freeze. He wasn't alone. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source of the noise, expecting to see one of Salvatore's guards. Instead, he saw nothing. Yet the sensation of a presence remained, a weight in the air, a feeling of being observed. "Who's there?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer came, but the shadows in the corner seemed to deepen, to take on an almost human shape for a brief moment before dissolving back into formless darkness. Lucas felt his heart racing. Was he losing his mind, or was the Cronovisor somehow affecting his perception of reality? The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted his thoughts. The heavy door swung open, revealing Salvatore, looking more haggard than he had earlier. The old man's skin had a greyish tinge, and the tremor in his hands had worsened. "It's time for your next lesson," Salvatore said, his voice weaker but still commanding. "Come with me." Lucas considered refusing, but what choice did he have? He needed to learn more about the Cronovisor if he was ever going to escape and expose Salvatore's crimes. Reluctantly, he stood and followed the ex-priest into the corridor. This time, they took a different route through the monastery, ascending rather than descending. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Lucas noticed that Salvatore had to pause frequently, leaning against the wall to catch his breath, his body clearly failing him. "The Cronovisor is killing you," Lucas observed as they paused on a landing. Salvatore smiled thinly. "Yes, extended exposure to the temporal fields has consequences. The human body isn't designed to exist in multiple time streams simultaneously." He straightened up with visible effort. "But my work is too important to abandon simply because of physical limitations." They continued climbing until they reached a heavy wooden door at the top of the tower. Salvatore produced an ancient iron key and unlocked it, revealing a circular room with windows on all sides, offering a panoramic view of the mountains and forests surrounding the monastery. The dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. But it wasn't the view that drew Lucas's attention. In the center of the room stood what appeared to be a smaller version of the Cronovisor, more compact, more elegant in design, but unmistakably related to the massive machine in the chamber below. "This is the original," Salvatore said, his voice taking on a reverent quality. "A Nettie's prototype, the one that started everything." Lucas approached it cautiously. Unlike the larger version, this device was built around what looked like an ornate antique mirror in a bronze frame, connected to various electronic components that seemed both modern and strangely archaic at the same time. "A mirror?" Lucas asked. "Appropriate, isn't it?" Salvatore replied. "A mirror that reflects not your face, but your soul, your sins." He ran his trembling fingers along the bronze frame. Annette believed that light and sound never truly disappear. They continue to exist as waves, diminishing but never completely vanishing. The Cronovisor simply captures these waves and reconstructs them. Lucas studied the device with a mixture of fascination and dread. "But your version does more than just capture. It influences." Salvatore nodded. "An unexpected development. We discovered that by focusing the temporal fields with sufficient intensity, we could create ripples, small disturbances in the fabric of time that could affect physical objects." His eyes took on a feverish gleam. "Do you understand what this means? The past isn't fixed, it's malleable. Everything we thought we knew about causality, about free will, it's all wrong." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. The implications were staggering, terrifying. If you can change the past, even in small ways, wouldn't that create paradoxes, alter the present? "That's the beauty of it," Salvatore said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "The universe protects itself. Changes propagate forward in time, but they do so in ways that maintain overall continuity. A cable that was always faulty becomes more faulty. A brake line that might have failed eventually fails sooner. The universe accommodates." He gestured toward the device. "This prototype is more limited than my enhanced version below. It can only observe, not influence. But it has one unique feature: it can show not just the past, but the present. It can find anyone, anywhere, as long as you have something connected to them." Salvatore reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Lucas's blood run cold: his wallet, which had been in his backpack when he was captured. "Let me demonstrate," Salvatore said, placing the wallet on a small platform attached to the device. He adjusted several dials, and the mirror's surface began to shimmer, its reflective quality giving way to a swirling mist that gradually resolved into an image. Lucas gasped. The mirror showed his apartment in perfect details, the walls covered with notes and maps, the computers, the books scattered everywhere, and moving through the space was a woman he recognized, his neighbor, Mrs. Pereira, who had a spare key for emergencies. She was packing his things into boxes, her face worried. Lucas could see her lips moving, though no sound came from the mirror. "She thinks you've disappeared," Salvatore said, watching Lucas's reaction carefully. "The police have been notified, but of course, they won't find anything. No one will ever connect your disappearance to this remote monastery." Lucas felt a surge of anger. "You've been planning this all along. You lured me here." Salvatore shook his head. I didn't lure you. I simply observed. I knew someone would eventually discover my work. The Cronovisor itself ensured that, sending out its signal like a beacon to those with the right kind of mind to understand it. He smiled thinly. You found me because you were meant to find me. He adjusted the dials again, and the image in the mirror changed. Now it showed a police station, where a detective was reviewing what appeared to be Lucas's case file. The man looked frustrated, flipping through pages of notes that clearly led nowhere. They'll search for a while, Salvatore continued. But eventually, you'll become just another unsolved disappearance. One of thousands who vanish every year without a trace. Lucas stared at the mirror, his mind racing. If the device could show the present, perhaps it could be used to send a message somehow, to alert someone to his location. As if reading his thoughts, Salvatore smiled. It's one way, I'm afraid. We can see, but we cannot be seen. We cannot communicate through it. He turned a dial, and the mirror went dark before returning to its normal, reflective state. Lucas found himself staring at his own reflection, pale, disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes. But there was something else there too, something behind him in the reflection that wasn't present in the room. A figure, indistinct and shadowy, standing just over his shoulder. Lucas spun around, but there was nothing there. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. What was that? He demanded, his voice shaking. Salvatore looked genuinely puzzled. What was what? In the mirror, there was something behind me. A look of understanding dawned on Salvatore's face, followed by what seemed like genuine concern. Ah, it's starting already. What's starting? The effects of prolonged proximity to the Cronovisor, Salvatore explained. It begins with visual anomalies, glimpses of things that aren't quite there, shadows that move independently, reflections that don't match reality. He sighed heavily. Later come the auditory hallucinations, voices whispering from empty rooms, the sound of footsteps when no one is walking. Lucas felt his stomach tighten with dread. You're saying the Cronovisor causes hallucinations? Not hallucinations, Salvatore corrected. Think of them as bleed-through, echoes from other time streams that your brain is suddenly able to perceive. He gestured vaguely around the room. Time isn't linear, Lucas. It's more like a pool. When you disturb the surface in one place, ripples spread everywhere. The Cronovisor creates very specific disturbances, and those who spend time near it become sensitive to the ripples. Lucas remembered the shadows he'd seen in his cell, the sense of being watched. The figures I've been seeing, they're real. In a manner of speaking, Salvatore replied, they're echoes of people who once existed, or still exist, in different time streams. Some may be victims of those I've judged. Others might be previous observers who didn't survive the experience. The casual way Salvatore mentioned these previous observers sent a chill through Lucas. What happened to them? Salvatore's expression darkened. Not everyone has the mental fortitude to withstand what the Cronovisor shows them. Some broke under the strain. Others became obsessed, using the device in ways even I found disturbing. He shook his head. The human mind isn't designed to perceive time as it truly is. It requires a certain flexibility. a willingness to accept that reality is not what we've been taught. He gestured toward the mirror. Would you like to see something else? Someone from your past, perhaps? Lucas hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to deny Salvatore the satisfaction of his curiosity. But another part, the part that had driven him to investigate the Cronovisor in the first place, couldn't resist the opportunity to see the device's full capabilities. My father, he said finally. He disappeared when I was 12. No one ever knew what happened to him. Salvatore nodded, as if he'd been expecting this request. Do you have anything of his? Something personal? Lucas reached into his pocket and withdrew the one item of his father's he always carried. An old pocket watch that had stopped working years ago. He handed it to Salvatore, who placed it carefully on the platform. When did he disappear? Salvatore asked, adjusting the dials. August 17th, 2005, Lucas replied, his throat suddenly dry. Salvatore made some final adjustments, and the mirror's surface began to shimmer once more. The mist swirled, then cleared to reveal a scene that made Lucas's heart skip a beat. His father, looking exactly as Lucas remembered him, was sitting in a car parked by the side of a rural road. He looked nervous, constantly checking his rearview mirror. On the passenger seat beside him was a briefcase. Where is this? Lucas whispered. About 50 kilometers outside of Snow Paulo, Salvatore replied, studying the image. Based on the temporal coordinates. In the mirror, Lucas's father opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of cash. He closed it quickly as another car pulled up behind him. Two men got out, hard-looking individuals with the unmistakable bearing of criminals. No, Lucas murmured, a sick feeling growing in his stomach as he began to understand what he was witnessing. His father got out of the car, briefcase in hand. Words were exchanged with the two men, though the mirror provided no sound. The exchange appeared heated. One of the men reached inside his jacket, and Lucas's father took a step back, raising his free hand in a placating gesture. What happened next unfolded with terrible swiftness. The man drew a gun and fired twice. Lucas's father crumpled to the ground, the briefcase falling from his grasp. The two men grabbed the briefcase, dragged Lucas's father's body to the edge of the road where a steep embankment led down to a river, and pushed him over. They returned to their car and drove away, leaving no trace of what had occurred except a dark stain on the asphalt. Lucas staggered back from the mirror, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He collapsed into a chair, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He was involved in something illegal, he said numbly. All these years, I thought he was a victim. Salvatore turned off the device, and the image faded. The past is rarely what we imagine it to be, he said, quietly. Our memories, our assumptions, they're colored by our desires, our need for a narrative that makes sense to us. Lucas felt tears burning in his eyes. His entire childhood had been defined by his father's disappearance, the mystery, the unanswered questions, the fantasies he'd created about his father being forced to go into hiding or assuming a new identity for some noble reason. The reality was so much more mundane, so much more sordid, a drug deal, or money laundering, or some other criminal enterprise gone wrong. Why show me this? Lucas asked, his voice breaking. Because you needed to see it, Salvatore replied simply. Because the Cronovisor doesn't just show us the sins of others, forces us to confront our own illusions, our own self-deceptions. He leaned closer, his eyes intense. That's its true power, Lucas. Not the ability to observe the past or influence events, but the way it strips away the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about the world and our place in it. Lucas wiped his eyes, a cold anger replacing his initial shock. And that gives you the right to play executioner, to decide who lives and who dies based on what you see in this mirror of sin. Salvatore straightened, his expression hardening. I don't expect you to understand yet, but you will. He gestured toward the door. That's enough for today. Return to your cell and reflect on what you've learned. As Lucas was escorted back to his cell by the same silent guards, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Grief for the father he'd lost, anger at the deception that had defined his childhood, and a growing, terrible fascination with the Cronovisor and its capabilities. Back in his cell, Lucas sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the stone wall opposite him. The revelation about his father had shaken him to his core, forcing him to reevaluate not just his memories, but his entire sense of self. Who was he, if the narrative he'd constructed about his past was built on a foundation of lies? As the hours passed, Lucas became aware of a subtle change in his perception. The shadows in the corners of his cell seemed deeper, more substantial. The air felt thicker, charged with an energy he couldn't name but could definitely feel. And the silence, it wasn't really silence at all, but a complex tapestry of sounds just below the threshold of hearing. Whispers, footsteps, the faint echo of events that may have happened centuries ago, or might not have happened yet. He closed his eyes, trying to block it all out, but that only made it worse. With his eyes shut, the sensations intensified a kaleidoscope of impressions flooding his mind. Fragments of lives lived and deaths died within these walls. Monks at prayer, prisoners in despair, Salvatore and his victims locked in an eternal moment of judgment. When Lucas opened his eyes again, he wasn't alone in the cell. A figure stood in the corner, man in his 40s, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to the 1990s. His form was translucent, his edges blurring into the shadows, but his eyes were terribly clear and fixed directly on Lucas. "You see me," the figure said, his voice sounding distant and hollow, as if coming from the bottom of a well. The others couldn't. Not until it was too late. Lucas pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering in his chest. "Who are you?" "Dr. Miguel Ferreira," the figure replied. Physicist, skeptic, Salvatore's previous candidate. His form flickered like a bad television signal. "I came here to debunk the Cronovisor. Ended up becoming part of it instead." Lucas swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this one of the echoes Salvatore had mentioned? A hallucination caused by proximity to the Cronovisor? Or something else entirely? "Are you dead?" he asked. The figure Ferreira made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Dead, alive. Those terms don't really apply anymore. I exist in a state of temporal flux, neither here nor there, neither then nor now." He moved closer, his form becoming more solid as he did. Salvatore doesn't understand what he's created. The Cronovisor doesn't just observe time it fractures, it creates splinters, alternate streams that shouldn't exist. Lucas felt a chill that went beyond physical cold. What do you mean? Every time he uses it to change something, he creates a new branch of reality, Ferreira explained, his voice urgent. But these branches aren't stable. They collapse, fold back into the main time stream, creating anomalies. People like me, caught between states of existence. He gestured around the cell. We're everywhere in this place. Watching, waiting. Some were Salvatore's victims. Others were like you and me, observers who got too close to the truth. Lucas thought of the shadows he'd been seeing, the sense of being watched. How many of you are there? Dozens, maybe hundreds by now. Ferreira's form flickered again, more violently this time. It's getting worse. Each use of the Cronovisor creates more fractures, more instability. If it continues, he shook his head. Reality itself could unravel around this place. I need to stop him, Lucas said, more to himself than to the apparition. Destroy the Cronovisor somehow. Yes, Ferreira agreed eagerly, but be careful. The device has evolved. It's developed a kind of consciousness, a survival instinct. It protects itself, and it protects Salvatore as long as he's useful to it. Lucas frowned. You're saying the Cronovisor is alive, not alive as we understand it, but aware, sentient in its own way. Ferreira's form began to fade, becoming more transparent. I can't stay much longer. It takes tremendous energy to manifest like this. Wait, Lucas called. How can I destroy it? How can I escape this place? Ferreira was barely visible now, just a faint outline against the shadows. The primary power coupling in the main chamber overloaded. His voice faded to a whisper. Be careful, the mirror shows more than sin, it shows truth, terrible truth. And then he was gone, leaving Lucas alone in the cell once more, at least seemingly alone. Now that he knew what to look for, he could sense the others, presences just beyond the veil of normal perception, watching him with a mixture of hope and despair. Lucas lay back on his thin mattress, mind racing. If what Ferreira had said was true, the situation was far more dangerous than he'd initially believed. The Cronovisor wasn't just a tool being misused by a deranged ex-priest, it was something far more sinister. An entity that had perhaps been using Salvatore as much as he had been using it. And now it had its sights set on Lucas as a potential replacement. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, Lucas's dreams were invaded by images from the Cronovisor, his father's murder, Rossetti's fiery death, and countless other scenes of violence and judgment that he hadn't witnessed but somehow knew had occurred. And through it all ran a constant, pulsing blue light and a sound like a heartbeat, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. In his dream, Lucas found himself standing before the mirror in the tower room. But instead of showing him the past or present, it reflected his own image, transformed, aged with the same feverish gleam in his eyes that he'd seen in Salvatore's. And behind this future self stood row upon row of shadowy figures, their eyes accusing, their mouths open in silent screams. The mirror of sin had shown Lucas a terrible possibility that he might become the very thing he now despised. that the power to observe and judge might corrupt him just as it had corrupted Salvatore. He woke with a gasp, sweat-soaked and trembling, to find Salvatore standing over his bed, watching him with an expression of understanding and anticipation. "You've seen them, haven't you?" the old man asked softly. "The echoes, the fragments of broken time." He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "It's beginning, Lucas. Your transformation. Your awakening to the true nature of reality." Lucas sat up, pressing himself against the wall to put as much distance as possible between himself and Salvatore. "What you're doing is wrong," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're fracturing time itself, creating abominations." Salvatore's smile faded. "Necessary sacrifices for a greater purpose. The Cronovisor is more than a tool, Lucas. It's a gateway to a new understanding of existence itself." He extended a trembling hand. "Come with me. There's something else I need to show you. Something that will help you understand." Lucas wanted to refuse, to stay in the relative safety of his cell. But he knew that understanding the full extent of what he was facing was his only hope of finding a way to stop it. Reluctantly, he took Salvatore's hand and allowed himself to be led once more into the depths of the monastery, where the Cronovisor waited like a patient spider at the center of a web of fractured time, drawing him inexorably toward a confrontation with the darkest reflections of his own soul. The corridors of the monastery seemed to shift and change as Lucas followed Salvatore, as if the very architecture of the place was as unstable as time itself. Shadows stretched and contracted in impossible ways, and more than once, Lucas caught glimpses of figures at the edge of his vision, transparent silhouettes that vanished when he turned to look directly at them. "You're seeing them more clearly now," Salvatore observed, noticing Lucas's darting glances, the temporal echoes. "It means you're becoming attuned to the Cronovisor's frequency. Or it means I'm losing my mind," Lucas muttered, trying to ignore a particularly persistent apparition, a young woman in clothing from the 1970s, who seemed to be following them, her eyes wide with warning or fear. Salvatore chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves rustling. "Sanity is merely consensus reality. When you perceive what others cannot, they call you mad. But perhaps you're simply awakened." They descended deeper into the monastery than Lucas had been before. Past the main chamber where the enhanced Cronovisor hummed and pulsed with its eerie blue light, down staircases that seemed to spiral endlessly into the earth. The air grew colder, damper, and charged with a strange electricity that made the hairs on Lucas's arms stand on end. "Where are we going?" Lucas asked, his breath visible in the increasingly frigid air. "To the heart," Salvatore replied cryptically, "to the place where it all began." Finally, they reached a massive stone door carved with symbols that Lucas recognized as a mixture of early Christian iconography and something older, more primal. Salvatore placed his trembling hand against the center of the door, and Lucas heard the grinding of ancient mechanisms within the stone. Slowly, ponderously, the door swung inward. Beyond lay a natural cavern, vast and dimly lit by the same blue luminescence that permeated the rest of the complex. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen daggers, and a small underground lake occupied the center of the space, its surface perfectly still and reflective as a mirror. But it was what stood at the far end of the cavern that drew Lucas's attention and made his blood run cold. A structure that could only be described as a prototype of the Cronovisor, but far more primitive and somehow more disturbing. Instead of the sleek metal and glass of the versions upstairs, this was constructed of rough-hewn wood, tarnished brass, and what appeared to be human bone, arranged in a circular pattern around a central chair that looked uncomfortably like a medieval torture device. "What is this place?" Lucas whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "The beginning," Salvatore said, his voice reverent. "Ernetti wasn't the first to attempt to pierce the veil of time. This structure dates back to the 14th century, built by a monk named Brother Ambrose, who claimed to have visions of both past and future. He approached the primitive device, running his fingers along its weathered surface. The church declared his work heretical, of course, had him executed for witchcraft, but they couldn't bring themselves to destroy his creation. Instead, they sealed it away, buried it beneath layers of stone and secrecy." Lucas stared at the device, feeling a deep, instinctive revulsion, and Ernetti found it. "Not exactly," Salvatore replied. "Ernetti rediscovered the principles independently. It was I who found this place, years after our official project was shut down." His eyes gleamed in the blue light. "Imagine my surprise when I realized that my mentor had merely reinvented what had been discovered centuries before." He gestured around the cavern. "This is where I truly perfected the Cronovisor. By combining Ernetti's technology with Brother Ambrose's insights, I created something far more powerful than either had envisioned." Lucas took an involuntary step back. "Why show me this?" "Because you need to understand the true nature of what we're dealing with," Salvatore said, suddenly serious. "The Cronovisor isn't just a machine, Lucas. It's a doorway, a bridge between realities." He pointed to the still surface of the underground lake. "Look." Lucas approached the edge of the lake cautiously. As he gazed into its mirror-like surface, he expected to see his own reflection. Instead, he saw nothing. The surface was perfectly reflective, yet it showed neither the cavern ceiling above, nor his own face looking down. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" he asked. "Wait," Salvatore instructed. As Lucas continued to stare, the surface of the lake began to ripple, though there was no wind or movement to disturb it. The ripples expanded outward from the center, and within them, images began to form, fleeting glimpses of places and times that couldn't possibly be reflected in the water. A medieval village burning, a modern city street crowded with people unaware of the watcher, a futuristic landscape of gleaming towers and flying vehicles, and faces, countless human faces expressing every emotion imaginable, from ecstasy to abject terror. "The lake is naturally attuned to temporal energies," Salvatore explained. "Brother Ambrose built his device here because he believed it was a place where the barriers between times were naturally thin, a place where past, present, and future bleed into one another." Lucas couldn't tear his eyes away from the shifting images in the water. They were coming faster now, a dizzying kaleidoscope of times and places that made his head spin and his stomach lurch. "Too much," he gasped, finally wrenching his gaze away. "It's too much." Salvatore nodded sympathetically. "It overwhelms at first. The human mind isn't designed to perceive time in its totality." He gestured toward the primitive Cronovisor. That's why we need interfaces devices that can filter and focus the temporal energies into something our brains can process. Lucas rubbed his temples, trying to clear the afterimages that still danced behind his eyelids. Why are you showing me all this? What do you want from me? Salvatore's expression grew solemn. I'm dying, Lucas. The extended exposure to the Cronovisor has taken its toll. My body is breaking down at the cellular level, my very atoms destabilizing as they try to exist in multiple time streams simultaneously. He held up his trembling hands. I have months at most, weeks, perhaps. He stepped closer, his eyes intense. Someone needs to continue my work. Someone with the right mind, the right flexibility of thought. Someone who can understand the true purpose of the Cronovisor. Killing people you judge as sinners, Lucas said bitterly. Salvatore shook his head. That's a means, not an end. The true purpose is far greater. He gestured expansively. Think about it, Lucas. If time is malleable, if the past can be altered in small ways that propagate forward, then reality itself can be reshaped, perfected. A chill ran down Lucas's spine as he began to understand the full scope of Salvatore's madness. You're trying to play God, to remake the world according to your own vision of perfection. Not my vision, Salvatore corrected. God's vision. I am merely his instrument, removing the cancers that infect his creation. One sinner at a time, one small adjustment at a time, moving humanity toward its true potential. Lucas felt sick. The megalomaniacal scale of Salvatore's delusion was staggering, and the temporal echoes, the fractured time streams, the people trapped between realities, are they part of this perfect world too? For the first time, Salvatore looked troubled. Unfortunate side effects, imperfections in the process that I haven't been able to resolve. He waved a dismissive hand. But you might succeed where I've failed. With your background in programming, your understanding of complex systems. No, Lucas interrupted firmly. I want no part of this. What you're doing isn't just murder, it's an abomination against nature itself. Anger flashed in Salvatore's eyes, quickly replaced by a calculating look. You say that now, but you felt it, haven't you? The power, the perspective, the Cronovisor changes you, Lucas. Opens your mind to possibilities you never imagined. He smiled thinly. You're already changing. I can see it in your eyes. The way you perceive the echoes more clearly with each passing hour. The way you're drawn to the Cronovisor despite your moral objections. Lucas wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. There was a part of him, a growing part, that was fascinated by the Cronovisor and its capabilities. A part that wondered what it would be like to sit in that chair, to direct its power, to reach across time and reshape reality according to his will. And that terrified him more than anything else. I'll never help you, he said, trying to sound more resolute than he felt. Salvatore merely smiled. We'll see. He gestured toward the exit. Come, there's one more thing I want to show you before I return you to your cell. As they left the cavern, Lucas glanced back at the primitive Cronovisor. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure sitting in the central chair, a gaunt monk in a medieval habit, his eyes hollow and burning with the same feverish intensity he'd seen in Brother Ambrose, perhaps, trapped in his own creation for centuries. Another victim of humanity's hubris in attempting to master time itself. They ascended through the monastery, but instead of returning to the cell block, Salvatore led Lucas to a different section, what appeared to be living quarters. They entered a sparsely furnished room with a single bed, a desk covered in papers and books, and walls lined with monitors displaying feeds from various parts of the complex. "My private chambers," Salvatore explained, gesturing for Lucas to sit in the room's only chair while he lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. "From here, I can monitor everything that happens in the monastery." Lucas glanced at the monitors, noting that several showed the main chamber where the enhanced Cronovisor pulsed with its hypnotic blue light. Others displayed corridors, the cell block, and various rooms he hadn't seen before. One screen showed the exterior of the monastery, where night had fallen once more. The mountains silhouetted against a star-filled sky. "How long have I been here?" Lucas asked suddenly, realizing he'd lost track of time completely. "For days," Salvatore replied, though time flows strangely around the Cronovisor. It might feel longer or shorter to you. It felt like weeks to Luchasaur, perhaps only hours. His perception of time had become as unstable as everything else in this place. Salvatore opened a drawer in the bedside table and removed a small leather-bound book. "I want you to read this," he said, handing it to Lucas. "My personal journal from the early days of my experiments. It might help you understand my journey." Lucas took the book reluctantly. "Why would I care about your journey?" "Because it might very well be your journey too," Salvatore replied. "I was like you once, skeptical, morally rigid, convinced of the absolute nature of right and wrong." His eyes took on a distant look. "The Cronovisor changed that, showed me the true complexity of morality across the vast canvas of time." He stood with visible effort. "Read it. Think about what I've shown you. We'll talk again tomorrow." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Lucas, don't bother trying to escape. Even if you could leave this room, the monastery is miles from any civilization, surrounded by wilderness. And in your current state," he gestured vaguely at Lucas, "the temporal echoes would overwhelm you completely without the monastery's shielding. Your mind would fracture within hours." With that ominous warning, he left, the door locking automatically behind him. Alone in Salvatore's quarters, Lucas examined the room more carefully, looking for anything that might help him escape or, better yet, destroy the Cronovisor. The monitors might provide useful information, but they appeared to be for viewing only, with no obvious way to control them or access the system behind them. The desk was covered with technical diagrams, mathematical equations, and handwritten notes in Salvatore's elegant script. Lucas leafed through them, recognizing elements of quantum theory, relativistic physics, and more esoteric concepts that seemed to blend science with mysticism. One diagram in particular caught his attention, a schematic of the enhanced Cronovisor, showing what appeared to be its power system. If Ferreira was right about overloading the primary power coupling, this might show him how to do it. Lucas studied the diagram carefully, committing the details to memory. The Cronovisor drew power from multiple sources: conventional electricity, some kind of geothermal tap into the earth beneath the monastery, and a third source, labeled simply temporal feedback loop, that he didn't understand but suspected was related to the device's more supernatural aspects. All these power sources converged at a central coupling located beneath the main chamber. If he could somehow overload that coupling, or disconnect the safety systems protecting it. A flicker of movement in one of the monitors drew his attention. The screen showing the main chamber now displayed something strange. The blue light of the Cronovisor was pulsing more rapidly than before, and around its base, shadowy figures were gathering. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all with the same translucent, unstable appearance as the echoes he'd been seeing. As Lucas watched, transfixed, the figures began to move in unison, circling the Cronovisor in a slow, deliberate pattern that reminded him uncomfortably of ritual movement. A dance or a ceremony of some kind. "What the hell?" he murmured, leaning closer to the screen. The temporal echoes continued their eerie procession, and as they moved, the Cronovisor's light pulsed in rhythm with their steps. It was as if the device and the echoes were communicating, synchronizing, building towards something. Lucas felt a pressure building in his head, a painful throbbing behind his eyes that intensified with each pulse of the blue light. He tried to look away from the screen, but found he couldn't. His gaze was locked on the hypnotic movement of the echoes and the pulsing of the light. And then, suddenly, one of the figures stopped its circular movement and turned to face the camera directly. It was Ferreira, the physicist who had appeared in Lucas's cell. His mouth moved, forming words that Lucas couldn't hear, but somehow understood anyway. "It's waking up. God, help us all." The pressure in Lucas's head exploded into blinding pain, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching his temples. The room around him seemed to warp and distort, reality itself becoming fluid and unstable. The walls breathed like living tissue, the floor rippled like water, and the air filled with whispers in 1,000 languages, some human, some decidedly not. Through the haze of pain, Lucas became aware that he wasn't alone in the room anymore. The temporal echoes were here too, surrounding him, their translucent forms more solid than he'd seen before. Men, women, children from across the centuries, all with the same haunted look in their eyes. "Help us," they seemed to say, though no sound came from their moving lips. "Stop it before it's too late." Lucas tried to speak, to ask what they meant, but no words would come. The pain was too intense, the pressure too great. He felt as if his skull might split open at any moment. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pain receded. The room stabilized, the echoes faded, and Lucas found himself lying on the floor, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. He pushed himself up to a sitting position, his limbs feeling strangely disconnected from his body. The monitors still showed the main chamber, but the scene had changed. The echoes were gone, and the Cronovisor's light had returned to its normal, steady pulse. Whatever had been happening was over for now. Lucas dragged himself to the chair and collapsed into it, trying to make sense of what he'd just experienced. It wasn't just a hallucination or a seizure, it felt more like a transmission, as if the echoes had been trying to communicate something urgent, something they couldn't or wouldn't say in Salvatore's presence. The Cronovisor was waking up. What did that mean? Ferreira had suggested the device had developed a kind of consciousness, a survival instinct. If that was true, if the Cronovisor was more than just a machine, Lucas's gaze fell on Salvatore's journal, still clutched in his hand despite the episode he'd just endured. Perhaps the answers were in there. With shaking fingers, he opened the book and began to read. The journal began 30 years ago, shortly after Annetti's official project had been shut down by the Vatican. Salvatore's early entries were filled with frustration and righteous indignation at the Church's short-sightedness and fear of true revelation. He described his decision to continue the research in secret, using resources and components he'd managed to salvage from the original project. As Lucas read on, he could trace the gradual evolution of Salvatore's thinking from a scientist seeking knowledge to a zealot convinced of his divine mission. The turning point seemed to be an entry dated 5 years after the project's termination. Breakthrough today. While observing the crucifixion of Christ verification of Annetti's earlier success, I experienced something extraordinary. Not just observation, but presence. I could feel the heat of the sun, smell the sweat and blood, hear the crowds cheer. And for a brief moment, so brief I thought I imagined it, Christ looked directly at me, saw me across the gulf of time. His eyes knew me. After that, Salvatore's entries became increasingly messianic in tone. He described how the Cronovisor had shown him the true pattern of history. Cosmic struggle between good and evil playing out across the centuries, with key individuals serving as nexus points where the balance could be tipped one way or the other. And then came the entry that made Lucas's blood run cold. The Cronovisor spoke to me today, not in words, but in visions and sensations. It showed me what it truly is, not just a device for observing time, but a living entity that exists outside of time entirely. It has always existed, will always exist. What Brother Ambrose built, what Annetti refined, what I have perfected, these are merely physical interfaces allowing it to interact with our limited three-dimensional reality. The entries after that documented Salvatore's growing conviction that the Cronovisor had chosen him as its prophet, its instrument in the physical world. He described how it guided him to sinners who needed to be removed from the timeline, how it taught him to make the small adjustments that would lead to their deaths in ways that appeared accidental or natural. But there were also hints of doubt, of fear. Entries where Salvatore questioned his own sanity or worried about the increasing instability of the temporal field around the monastery. Notes about the first appearances of the echoes, and his growing realization that they were fragments of people whose timelines had been altered or erased by his actions. The final entries were the most disturbing. Salvatore wrote of dreams in which the Cronovisor showed him a future where it had spread beyond the monastery, where interfaces had been built in cities around the world, allowing the entity to extend its influence across all of human civilization. A future where time itself had become malleable, where reality was constantly being rewritten according to the inscrutable desires of the entity behind the Cronovisor. The very last entry, dated just 1 week ago, read simply, "It needs a new vessel. Mine is failing. He comes." Lucas closed the journal, his mind reeling. If even half of what Salvatore had written was true, the situation was far worse than he'd imagined. The Cronovisor wasn't just a dangerous device being misused by a madman, it was something ancient and alien. Something that had been influencing human history for centuries, perhaps millennia. And now it wanted him as its next vessel. As this realization sank in, Lucas became aware of a subtle change in his perception. The room around him seemed more vivid somehow. Colors more intense, sounds sharper. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him, layers upon layers of past and future events all existing simultaneously, and he could see them faint at first, then with increasing clarity. The temporal echoes were everywhere, filling the room, filling the entire monastery, but they weren't just random fragments anymore. They were organizing, aligning, forming patterns that his mind struggled to comprehend. Lucas stood up, turning slowly to take in the impossible scene. The echoes were forming a vast, complex structure that extended in directions his three-dimensional mind couldn't fully grasp. It was as if he was seeing a four-dimensional object projected into three-dimensional space, a hypercube, or something even more complex. And at the center of this impossible structure was a void, an absence that somehow felt more present, more real than anything around it. The entity behind the Cronovisor revealing itself to him at last. Lucas felt it reaching for his mind, tendrils of awareness extending across the dimensional barrier. He tried to resist, to shield his thoughts, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. The entity was vast, ancient, its consciousness so alien that merely brushing against it threatened to shatter his sanity. Images flooded his mind, civilizations rising and falling, species evolving and going extinct, the birth and death of stars, all observed by this patient, eternal watcher. And beneath it all, a hunger, a desire to do more than just observe, to shape, to control, to become. With the last shreds of his independent consciousness, Lucas understood what the entity truly wanted. It didn't just want a new human vessel to operate the Cronovisor. It wanted to fully enter the physical world, to incarnate itself in human form. Salvatore had been its first attempt, but his body had proven too weak, his mind too rigid despite his apparent surrender to the entity's will. Lucas, with his younger body and more flexible mind, was to be its next attempt, a more perfect vessel for its emergence into the world of matter and time. No, Lucas gasped, falling to his knees as the pressure in his mind intensified. I won't let you in. I won't be your puppet. The entity had no voice, but Lucas felt its response anyway, a cold amusement, a patient certainty. It had waited centuries. It could wait longer if necessary. But in the end, he would surrender, just as Salvatore had, just as Brother Ambrose had before him, just as all its chosen vessels eventually did. The pressure receded slightly, the visions faded, and Lucas found himself alone in the room once more, or as alone as anyone could be in this place where time itself was wounded and bleeding. He was drenched in sweat, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his mind was clearer than it had been since his arrival at the monastery. He knew now what he had to do. The Cronovisor couldn't be controlled or contained, it had to be destroyed, completely and permanently. And he had to do it soon, before his mind was further compromised, before the entity could fully establish its hold on him. Lucas forced himself to his feet and moved to the door. To his surprise, it wasn't locked anymore. Salvatore had forgotten in his haste. Or, more likely, the entity wanted him to move freely through the monastery, now that it had revealed itself to him. The corridors outside were deserted, but Lucas could feel the echoes all around him, watching, waiting. Some seemed to be trying to help, guiding him with subtle gestures toward the main chamber where the enhanced Cronovisor hummed and pulsed. Others tried to block his path, their translucent forms becoming momentarily solid enough to create cold spots that he instinctively avoided. As he made his way through the labyrinthine monastery, Lucas's perception continued to shift and change. Time seemed to flow differently in different sections, speeding up in some corridors, slowing to a crawl in others. More than once, he found himself in places that couldn't possibly exist within the physical confines of the building vast. Impossible spaces that folded in on themselves in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. The entity was toying with him, he realized, showing him the true nature of reality as it perceived it, trying to break down his human understanding of space and time to make him more receptive to its influence. But with each impossible sight, each violation of the physical laws he had always taken for granted, Lucas felt not surrender but a growing determination. This thing, whatever it was, did not belong in his world. It was an intruder, a parasite feeding on human consciousness and bending reality to its alien will. Finally, after what seemed like hours of wandering through the shifting, impossible architecture of the monastery, Lucas found himself back at the main chamber. The massive door stood open, as if inviting him in. Beyond, the enhanced Cronovisor pulsed with its hypnotic blue light, more intense than he had ever seen it. Lucas hesitated at the threshold. Once he entered that room, there would be no turning back. The entity would know his intentions immediately, would bring all its power to bear to stop him. And Salvatore, where was he? Surely he wouldn't leave his precious Cronovisor unguarded. As if in answer to his unspoken question, Lucas heard a sound from within the chamber, low moan of pain or despair. Cautiously, he peered around the doorframe. Salvatore was there, kneeling before the Cronovisor in an attitude of supplication. But something was terribly wrong. The old man's body was changing. His skin had taken on a bluish tinge that matched the light of the Cronovisor, and in places it had become translucent, revealing not blood and bone beneath, but swirling patterns of light and energy. The transformation that Salvatore had described, that he had warned was killing him, had accelerated dramatically. He was becoming something no longer fully human, a hybrid of flesh and temporal energy, a physical vessel being remade to better channel the entity's consciousness. As Lucas watched in horror, Salvatore turned his head, seeming to sense his presence. His eyes were gone, replaced by orbs of pulsing blue light identical to the glow of the Cronovisor. "Lucas," he said, his voice distorted and overlaid with harmonics that hurt Lucas's ears. "It has begun, the merging, the ascension." He raised arms that were more light than matter now. "Join us. Become part of something greater than yourself, greater than humanity." Lucas backed away, revulsion and pity warring within him. This was what awaited him if he failed to destroy the Cronovisor, of fate worse than death. The complete subsumption of his identity into the alien consciousness of the entity. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Salvatore or to himself for what he was about to attempt. "This has to end." With that, he steeled himself and entered the chamber, moving quickly toward the Cronovisor with one goal in mind: to reach the primary power coupling that he had seen in the schematic and overload it somehow. The moment he stepped fully into the room, Lucas felt the entity's attention focus on him with laser-like intensity. The air thickened, becoming almost solid, slowing his movements as if he were trying to walk through syrup. The blue light of the Cronovisor pulsed faster, more aggressively, and the humming sound it emitted rose in pitch until it was a painful whine that drilled into his skull. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Salvatore said, his voice now barely recognizable as human. "The bleeding of time cannot be stretched. The barriers are already falling." Lucas ignored him, fighting against the resistant air, pushing himself forward step by agonizing step. The Cronovisor loomed before him, its circular metal frame now spinning slowly, generating a vortex of blue energy that reached toward the ceiling in a twisting column. He needed to get to the base, to the access panel that would expose the power coupling. But with each step, the resistance increased, and new obstacles appeared, temporal echoes materializing directly in his path, becoming momentarily solid enough to block him, then dissipating before he could push through them. "Lucas," a voice called from behind him, a different voice, familiar yet unexpected. "Lucas, stop. Think about what you're doing." He turned, shocked to see his father standing there, not as he had appeared in the mirror, not as the middle-aged man who had been murdered in a criminal deal gone wrong, but as Lucas remembered him from childhood. Strong, confident, smiling that smile that had always made Lucas feel safe and loved. "Dad," Lucas whispered, knowing it couldn't be real but unable to help himself. "It's me, son," the apparition said, stepping closer. "The Cronovisor brought me here, across time, to help you understand." He gestured around the chamber. "This is a gift, Lucas. The greatest gift humanity has ever received. The ability to transcend time itself, to become something more than we are." Lucas shook his head, tears blurring his vision. "You're not real. You're just the entity trying to manipulate me." His father's expression turned sad. "Is that what you think? That none of this is real?" He held out his hand. "Take my hand, son. Feel for yourself." For a moment, Lucas was tempted. The longing to touch his father again, to feel that connection he had lost so many years ago, was almost overwhelming. But then he remembered what he had seen in the mirror, the truth about his father's death, the criminal activities he had been involved in. "My real father is dead," Lucas said firmly. "Killed because of his own bad choices. You're just a memory, a reflection, not real." The apparition's face contorted with anger, the kindly features melting away to reveal something inhuman beneath a swirling vortex of temporal energy, barely contained in human form. "You will join us," it hissed in a voice that was neither his father's nor Salvatore's, but something ancient and terrible. "Willingly or not, you will become the vessel." Lucas turned away, redoubling his efforts to reach the Cronovisor. The air was like concrete now, each movement requiring all his strength. But he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that this might be humanity's only chance to stop whatever was happening here. Behind him, he heard Salvatore, what had once been Salvatore, moving. The sound no longer footsteps, but a strange, liquid rushing. He didn't dare look back, focusing all his attention on the base of the Cronovisor, now just a few feet away. Finally, he reached it, collapsing against the metal surface, his strength nearly spent. The metal was vibrating intensely, humming with power, and it felt neither hot nor cold, but somehow both simultaneously another. Impossibility in a place where the laws of physics were merely suggestions. With trembling hands, Lucas located the access panel he had seen in the schematic. It was secured with a complex electronic lock, but to his surprise, it clicked open at his touch, as if the Cronovisor itself was inviting him in. Inside was a bewildering array of components, some recognizably electronic, others seemingly biological, and still others that defied categorization entirely. But there, at the center, was what had to be the primary power coupling, a crystalline structure about the size of his fist, pulsing with the same blue light as the Cronovisor itself. Lucas reached for it, but before his fingers could make contact, a hand closed around his wrist, a hand that was partly flesh, partly glowing energy. Salvatore, or what remained of him, you don't understand what you're doing. The thing that had been Salvatore's said, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. Destroy the coupling, and the temporal energy will be released all at once. The consequences would be catastrophic. Lucas tried to pull away, but the grip on his wrist was inhumanly strong. Better than letting that thing into our world, he gasped. It's already in our world, Salvatore replied. Has been since the beginning of time. The Cronovisor is just its latest interface, its latest attempt to communicate with us, to elevate us, to control us, Lucas countered, to remake reality according to its will. Salvatore's grip tightened painfully. I can't let you do this. The work is too important. They struggled there, at the base of the Cronovisor, as the blue light pulsed more frantically above them, and the air in the chamber became charged with an energy that made every hair on Lucas's body stand on end. He could feel Salvatore's inhuman strength gradually overwhelming him, forcing his arms away from the coupling. And then, unexpectedly, help came. Temporal echoes, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, materialized around them. But, unlike before, they weren't simply watching. They were acting, reaching out with their translucent hands to pull at Salvatore, to weaken his grip on Lucas. Lucas recognized some of them: Ferreira, the physicist, the young woman who had followed them through the corridors. Others he had glimpsed in his time at the monastery. All victims of the Cronovisor in one way or another. All fighting against the entity that had trapped them in this limbo between times. Now, Ferreira's echo shouted, his voice distant but clear. Do it now, while we can hold him. With a final surge of strength, Lucas broke free of Salvatore's weakened grip and plunged both hands into the access panel, grasping the crystalline coupling firmly. It was vibrating violently now, the blue light within it pulsing so rapidly it appeared almost solid. I'm sorry, Lucas whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was apologizing. To Salvatore, the echoes, himself, or the world that might be forever changed by what he was about to do. Then, with all his remaining strength, he twisted the coupling and pulled it free from its housing. For a moment, nothing happened. The Cronovisor's light continued to pulse, the humming continued, and Lucas thought he had failed. Then, a high-pitched whine began to emanate from the device, rising rapidly in volume and pitch until it was beyond the range of human hearing, felt rather than heard as a pressure inside the skull. The blue light flared blindingly bright, forcing Lucas to shield his eyes. Through his fingers, he saw Salvatore rise from the floor, his partly transformed body lifted by unseen forces, his arms outstretched as if in crucifixion. The light seemed to pour into him, through him, using him as a conduit for energies that no human form was meant to channel. "What have you done?" Salvatore screamed, his voice no longer even remotely human, but a cacophony of sounds from across time and space. "You've doomed us all." The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones falling from the ceiling. The Cronovisor's metal frame was vibrating so violently now that it was blurring, becoming indistinct. Cracks appeared in its surface, leaking more of the blue light, which seemed to have weight and substance, pooling on the floor like liquid. Lucas backed away, trying to reach the door, but found his path blocked by a wall of the blue energy, not solid, but somehow impenetrable nonetheless. He was trapped in the chamber with the failing Cronovisor and the entity's fury. The temporal echoes were still there, but they were changing to becoming more solid, more present. Some looked at Lucas with gratitude, others with fear or anger. Ferreira approached him, his form now almost completely physical. "The barriers are collapsing," he shouted over the rising cacophony of sounds filling the chamber. "The time streams are bleeding into one another. You need to get out of here." Before he never finished the sentence, with a sound like reality itself tearing, a blinding flash of blue-white light erupted from the Cronovisor, engulfing everything in the chamber. Lucas felt himself lifted off his feet, his body seeming to dissolve into pure energy, his consciousness expanding outward in all directions at once. For an eternal moment, he perceived everything, all of time and space, laid out before him like a vast tapestry. He saw the entity clearly now, a vast, incomprehensible intelligence that existed outside of time, that had been reaching into the human world through devices like the Cronovisor since the dawn of civilization. He saw its plans, its purpose neither malevolent nor benevolent as humans understood those terms, but utterly alien, utterly other. And he saw what his actions had done, not destroyed the entity, for such a thing could not be destroyed, but severed its connection to this particular point in space-time, closed a door that had been opening wider with each passing day. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the expansion stopped. Lucas felt himself snapping back into his body, into a single point in space and time. The blue light receded, the sounds faded, and he found himself lying on the floor of the chamber, every muscle aching, his mind struggling to process what had happened. The Cronovisor was gone. In its place was a scorched circle on the floor, still smoking slightly. Of Salvatore there was no sign either, destroyed completely in the release of energy, or perhaps taken by the entity as it retreated from this reality. The temporal echoes were gone too, presumably freed from their limbo by the destruction of the device that had trapped them. The chamber was silent, ordinary, just a room carved from stone beneath an ancient monastery. Lucas lay there for a long time, too exhausted to move, his mind trying to make sense of everything he had experienced. Had he succeeded? Had he truly stopped whatever the entity had been planning? He didn't know, perhaps couldn't know. But as he finally found the strength to sit up, to look around at the now mundane chamber, he felt something he hadn't felt since entering the monastery hope. A sense that whatever had been happening here, whatever wound in time had been bleeding, was now, if not healed, at least bandaged. The bleeding time had been staunched, at least for now. The entity had been forced back to whatever dimension or reality it called home. And Lucas was still himself, still human, still sane, or as sane as anyone could be after what he had witnessed. As he struggled to his feet, planning to find his way out of the monastery and back to civilization, Lucas became aware of a subtle change in his perception. The world around him seemed thinner somehow, more transparent, as if he could see through the veil of the present to the layers of past and future that lay beneath. A lasting effect of his exposure to the Cronovisor, or something more, a change in his fundamental nature, a permanent alteration in how he perceived reality. Lucas didn't know, but as he made his way slowly toward the chamber door, he caught a glimpse of something in his peripheral vision, a flicker of movement, a suggestion of a figure watching from the shadows. When he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. But he knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that he was not alone, that he would never be truly alone again. The bleeding time had left its mark on him, had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. And somewhere, beyond the veil of normal perception, the entity was watching, waiting, planning its next attempt to enter a world it found so fascinating, so full of potential. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. Detective Elena Cortez stared at the video playing on her computer screen, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing unease. The footage, recovered from a damaged phone found at the abandoned San Cipriano monastery 3 weeks ago, showed a disheveled young man with haunted eyes speaking directly to the camera. According to the case file, his name was Lucas Mendeza, programmer who had disappeared without a trace nearly 2 months earlier. "This will probably be my last recording," the man on the screen said, his voice hoarse, his eyes constantly darting to look at something off camera. "If you're watching this, then you've found my phone, which means you found the monastery, but I doubt you'll find me." Elena paused the video and took a sip of her now cold coffee. This case had landed on her desk after local police had given up, classifying it as just another unsolved disappearance. But something about it had caught her attention, the strange circumstances. The remote location, the fragmented video files that seemed to tell a story too bizarre to be a hoax. She pressed play again. "I don't have much time," Lucas continued, the camera shaking slightly in his unsteady hands. "The monastery isn't stable anymore. Reality itself is breaking down here. But I need to record what happened, what I discovered. Someone needs to know the truth about the Cronovisor." Elena had already watched this video 3 times, along with the other fragments recovered from the phone. Each viewing left her with more questions than answers. The man spoke of impossible things, a device that could view the past, an entity that existed outside of time, a conspiracy spanning centuries. Under normal circumstances, she would have dismissed it as the ravings of a mentally ill individual. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The phone had been found alongside strange equipment of unknown origin technology that the department's experts couldn't identify. The monastery itself showed signs of an unexplained energy discharge, with patterns of molecular disturbance that defied conventional explanation. And then there were the other disappearances, at least 7 people over the past 30 years who had gone missing in the vicinity of the monastery, including a physicist named Miguel Ferreira, whose case Alina had reopened after finding his name mentioned in Lucas's recordings. "The Cronovisor is gone now," Lucas was saying, his face illuminated by what appeared to be early morning light coming through a window. "I destroyed Aitor, at least I destroyed this version of it. But the entity behind it that's still out there, watching, waiting, looking for another way in." He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, his eyes bloodshot from what Alina assumed was lack of sleep. "I've been hiding in the village for 3 days now. The locals avoid me. I think they know, they've always known, that something was wrong with the monastery. They can sense it, even if they don't understand it." The video cut abruptly, then resumed with Lucas in a different location, what appeared to be a small hotel room. "I found Salvatore's records," he said, holding up a leather-bound book. Names, dates, details of all his interventions. All the people he killed using the Cronovisor. "I'm going to turn this over to the authorities, but I don't expect them to believe the full story." How could they? Alina glanced at the evidence box on her desk, which contained the book in question. It had been found with the phone, and its contents were as disturbing as Lucas had suggested. Detailed accounts of deaths that had been ruled accidents or natural causes, all described as judgments carried out through manipulation of past events. The department's researchers had confirmed that the deaths mentioned in the book were real, though they had attributed the author's claims of responsibility to delusional thinking. But Alina wasn't so sure. The video continued, showing Lucas becoming increasingly agitated. "I can still see them," he whispered, his eyes tracking something invisible to the camera. "The echoes, they followed me from the monastery. Fragments of people caught between time streams. Some are Salvatore's victims, others are something else. Observers like me who got too close to the truth." He leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping even lower. "And I can feel it watching me. The entity. It's not confined to the Cronovisor. That was just its interface, its way of interacting with our reality. It's everywhere, everyone. And it's not done with me." Alina felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warmth of her office. There was something in Lucas's eyes, a haunted quality that went beyond fear or mental illness. A certainty that was more disturbing than any amount of paranoid ranting. "I'm leaving these records behind because I don't think I'll be able to deliver them in person," Lucas continued. "I'm going to try to get to Rome, to find someone at the Vatican who might know about Ernetti's original work. Someone who might understand what we're dealing with and how to stop it permanently." The video cut again, resuming in what appeared to be a train station. Lucas looked worsener, paler, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look like he hadn't slept in days. "Something's happening to me," he said, his voice barely audible over the background noise of the station. "The exposure to the Cronovisor changed me. I'm seeing things I shouldn't be able to see, past and future overlapping with the present, reality becoming permeable." He glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer to the camera. "I think the entity is trying to use me as its new vessel, like it used Salvatore. I can feel it pressing against the edges of my mind, looking for a way in. I don't know how long I can resist." Alina paused the video again, making a note in her case file. This matched with the psychological evaluation that had been compiled based on the recovered materials of profile, suggesting that Lucas had experienced some form of psychotic break, developing delusions about time travel and supernatural entities. But again, there were inconsistencies that troubled her. The technical knowledge displayed in some of Lucas's notes was far too sophisticated to be the product of a delusional mind, and some of the details he mentioned about the monastery's history had been verified through independent research, including information that wasn't publicly available. She resumed playback. "I've been researching other cases," Lucas said, now appearing in what looked like an internet cafe. "Other devices throughout history that might have been previous versions of the Cronovisor. There are Patton's medieval monks who claim to see visions of the future, Renaissance inventors who disappeared after creating scrying devices, modern physicists whose work on temporal mechanics was suppressed or who died under mysterious circumstances." He held up a notebook filled with cramped handwriting and diagrams. "It's been happening for centuries. The entity reaches out, finds someone with the right kind of mind, guides them to create an interface, and then uses them, discards them when they're no longer useful." The video cut once more, and when it resumed, Alina felt her breath catch. Lucas was now in a bathroom, recording himself in a mirror. But what shocked her wasn't his appearance, though he looked even worse than before, but what appeared to be behind him. A shadowy figure, indistinct but unmistakably human-shaped, standing just over his shoulder. Lucas didn't seem to notice it as he spoke. "I'm in Rome now. Going to the Vatican tomorrow. I've made contact with someone who claims to have access to Annetti's original files. Someone who might believe me." The figure behind him seemed to shift slightly, moving closer to Lucas without him reacting. Alina found herself wanting to shout a warning, even though she knew this video was weeks old, the events already long past. "If anything happens to me," Lucas continued, "look for the patterns, the deaths that seem like accidents but aren't, the people who disappear while researching certain topics, the devices that get classified or destroyed because they don't work or are too dangerous." He leaned closer to the mirror. "It's all connected, all part of the entity's attempts to find a way into our world." The shadowy figure was now directly behind Lucas, almost touching him, and for a brief moment, Alina thought she saw its features resolve into something recognizably. Older man with stern features and cold eyes. Then it was just a shadow again. "One last thing," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you start seeing them, the echoes, the shadows, if you start feeling like time isn't flowing quite right around you, run. Get as far away as you can, because it means the entity has noticed you, has marked you as a potential vessel." The figure behind him raised what might have been an arm, reaching toward Lucas's shoulder. "This is Lucas Mendez, final transmission," he said. "May God help us all." The video ended abruptly as the shadowy hand made contact with Lucas's shoulder. Alina sat back in her chair, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She had initially attributed the figure to a video artifact or trick of the light, but seeing it move, seeing it reach out, she shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She was a detective, trained to look for rational explanations, not to indulge in supernatural fantasies. There had to be a logical explanation for everything in the video, the strange equipment, Lucas's deteriorating mental state, even the apparent figure in the mirror. And yet, she opened the case file again, reviewing the facts. Lucas Mendez had indeed traveled to Rome, according to immigration records. He had checked into a small hotel near the Vatican on May 12th. And then, nothing. No credit card activity, no phone calls. He had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. The Vatican had denied any knowledge of him or any meeting with their officials. The someone Lucas had mentioned contacting remained unidentified. Alina turned to her computer and pulled up the file containing the technical analysis of the strange equipment found at the monastery. The report was filled with cautious academic language that essentially amounted to "we have no idea what this is." Components that shouldn't work together but somehow did. Materials that defied conventional analysis. Power sources that operated on principles the department's experts couldn't explain. Then there was the physical evidence from the monastery itself. The circular burn mark on the floor of the underground chamber, where something had released enough energy to vitrify the stone. The unusual radiation readings that didn't match any known type of nuclear or electromagnetic discharge. The reports from the local villagers of strange lights and sounds in the days before Lucas's arrival and after his departure. Alina closed the file and rubbed her eyes. It was late, well past the end of her shift, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not with the questions swirling in her mind. Not with the nagging feeling that she was missing something important. She reached for her coffee, then froze as she caught a glimpse of movement reflected in her computer screen. Something behind her, in the darkened corner of her office. Slowly, heart pounding, she turned to look. Nothing, just shadows cast by the desk lamp. The familiar outlines of filing cabinets and bookshelves. Alina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was letting the video get to her, seeing things that weren't there because she'd been staring at the screen too long. Her mind filled with Lucas's bizarre story. She turned back to her computer, intending to shut it down for the night, when something on the screen caught her attention. A new email had arrived while she was watching the video, marked urgent. The subject line made her blood run cold, regarding the Cronovisor investigation. With a slightly trembling hand, she opened it. The email was brief, just a few lines. Detective Cortez, I understand you're investigating the disappearance of Lucas Mendez and the events at San Cipriano Monastery. I have information that may be relevant to your case. Meet me tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the Biblioteca Angelica. Come alone, a friend. There was no signature, and the email address was an anonymous temporary account that would likely lead nowhere if she tried to trace it. Alina stared at the message, conflicting instincts warring within her. The professional detective in her recognized this as potentially dangerous an anonymous source. A secluded meeting, the melodramatic instruction to come alone. Classic red flags. But another part of her, the part that had been increasingly troubled by the inconsistencies in this case, saw this as an opportunity to finally get some answers. She saved the email and shut down her computer, deciding to sleep on it before making a decision. As she gathered her things to leave, she caught another flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, just at the edge of sight. A suggestion of a figure standing in the doorway of her office. When she turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just the empty doorway and the darkened hallway beyond. Elena shook her head, blaming fatigue and an overactive imagination stimulated by hours of reviewing Lucas's disturbing videos. She needed sleep, needed to approach this case with a clear head and rational mind in the morning. As she walked to her car in the nearly empty parking garage, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be. Every echo of her footsteps slightly out of sync with her movements. Inside her car, with the doors locked and the familiar comfort of the enclosed space around her, Elena finally allowed herself to consider the possibility she had been avoiding all day. What if Lucas was telling the truth? What if there really was something out there? Something that existed outside of normal time and space. Something that had been influencing human history for centuries through devices like the something that had taken Lucas, just as it had taken Salvatore and who knew how many others before them. And if that was true, what did it mean that she was now investigating the case? Had she, by the simple act of viewing those videos and reading those files, already drawn its attention? Elena started her car, the engine's rumble providing a comforting reminder of the normal, physical world. She was being ridiculous, letting her imagination run away with her. Tomorrow, in the clear light of day, she would approach this case as she would any other, with logic, evidence, and professional detachment. She pulled out of the parking garage and onto the nearly empty street, her headlights cutting through the darkness. As she waited at a red light, she glanced in her rearview mirror. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw someone in the back seat, a figure with indistinct features, but unmistakably there. She whipped around, adrenaline surging through her body. The back seat was empty. Elena turned back to the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The light had turned green, and she accelerated, perhaps a bit too quickly, eager to get home, to the safety and normalcy of her apartment. But as she drove through the quiet streets, a new thought occurred to her, one that sent a chill down her spine, despite the warm night air coming through the car's vents. What if home wasn't safe either? What if nowhere was safe once the entity had noticed you? She tried to dismiss the thought, to focus on the road and the rational world around her. But her eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, checking the back seat, and her ears strained to hear anything unusual over the sound of the engine. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could almost hear Lucas's voice from the video. If you start seeing them, the echoes, the shadows, if you start feeling like time isn't flowing quite right around you, run. Get as far away as you can. But where could you run, she wondered, from something that existed outside of time itself? As Elena drove through the night, the city lights blurring around her, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go to the Biblioteca Angelica. She would meet this mysterious friend. She would follow this case wherever it led, even if that meant confronting possibilities that defied rational explanation. Because if Lucas was right, if even a fraction of what he had recorded was true, then this wasn't just about solving a disappearance anymore. It was about something much larger, much more important. It was about protecting the very fabric of reality from an entity that sought to reshape it according to its own inscrutable desires. And if she was already marked, already noticed by this entity, well, then she had nothing to lose by seeking the truth, wherever it might lead. Alina glanced in the rearview mirror one more time. This time, she wasn't surprised to see a faint, bluish glow emanating from the empty backseater light that pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. The same blue light that Lucas had described in his videos. The light of the Cronovisor. "I see you," she whispered to the empty car. A strange calm settling over her despite the impossibility of what she was experiencing. "And I'm not afraid." The light pulsed once more, brighter this time, as if in acknowledgement. Then it was gone, leaving Alina alone in the darkness with nothing but the road ahead, and the weight of a truth too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. But she would try, for Lucas, for all the others who had disappeared into the cracks between moments of time, and for a world that didn't yet know it was being watched by something ancient and patient and hungry, something that was still searching for the perfect vessel to bring it fully into our reality, something that might, even now, be turning its attention to a detective who had seen too much, who knew too much, who might be just the right kind of mind to serve as its next interface with the world of matter and time. Alina drove on through the night, toward a future that was suddenly far less certain than it had been just hours before. And somewhere, in the spaces between moments, in the shadows between heartbeats, the entity watched and waited. The final transmission had been received. The next phase was about to begin.